On a Tuesday morning in 1987, Raymond Aldiss stood at the edge of his north pasture with a pair of wire pliers in one hand and a knot of salvaged fencing wire in the other, working slow and steady the way he always did, post to post, tightening each strand by hand the way his father had taught him 30 years before on this same ground. Gerald Holt was already there. Gerald was the county's biggest agricultural contractor, a thick-shouldered man in a clean Carhartt jacket who had never once been wrong about anything, or so he believed. He had driven his Ford F-250 right up to the fence line, window down, arm resting on the door, watching Raymond work with the kind of smile a man wears when he is deciding whether something is worth laughing at. He decided it was. "Raymond," he called out, loud enough for the 2 county extension workers standing by his truck to hear every word. "You are building that fence out of garbage." Raymond did not look up. "That wire is 20 years old if it's a day," Gerald went on. "Half of it's kinked. The posts are second-hand cedar. I can see the old staple holes from here. You're stringing that across 200 acres of open pasture, and the first good windstorm is going to drop it flat." Raymond kept working. He set his pliers on the next strand, pulled it taut with both hands, and twisted the tie wire with the quiet precision of a man who has done one thing so many times that his hands know it without being told. Gerald shook his head and looked at the extension workers. 200 acres, he said again, as if the number itself was the joke. "He'll be restringing it before Thanksgiving." One of the extension workers laughed politely. The other looked at the ground. Gerald leaned further out the window. "I got galvanized 12.5 gauge high-tensile sitting in my yard. Brand new. I could have this whole north pasture done in 4 days with my hydraulic post driver and a crew of 3. Cost you about $4,000, and it'd stand for 30 years. He paused. "Whatever that is you're stringing, Raymond, it won't stand for 30 days. Raymond pulled the next strand taut and tied it off. He moved down the line to the next post without a word. Gerald drove away, shaking his head. What Gerald Holt could not know, and would not know until September of 1989, was that he had just watched the most important 200 acres of fencing in Calloway County being built correctly. The extension workers Gerald brought with him that morning were not wrong to be skeptical on the surface of things. What Raymond Aldiss was working with looked, to anyone passing at speed on the county road, like the kind of wire a man pulls off an old fence before he burns the posts. It was salvaged wire. That part was true. Some of it had come from the east fence his father had put up in 1951. Some of it had come from a neighbor's property 3 miles south, a man named Dewey Trant who had sold off his herd in 1979 and let Raymond have the wire for nothing rather than see it rust to nothing in the field. Some sections were newer, purchased in small quantities from the Calloway Feed and Supply over the course of several years, but even those had been sitting in Raymond's barn long enough to lose their bright finish. The posts were indeed second-hand cedar, pulled from 2 different fence lines on Raymond's own land, the holes plugged with wooden pegs and reset in new ground. Raymond had sorted them himself, pulling each post from the pile, sighting down its length, pressing his thumbnail into the grain to check for rot. He had rejected about 1 in 5. The ones he kept were sound as the day they were cut. By the end of the first week of October 1987, Raymond had strung 60 acres. By mid-November, he had finished the full 200. He worked alone every day, starting at first light, stopping at dark. His wife Edna brought his lunch out to whatever stretch of fence he was working on, and sometimes she stayed to watch him work for a few minutes before driving the old farm truck back to the house. She never questioned what he was doing or why. She had been married to the man for 31 years, and she understood that when Raymond Aldiss built something, it stayed built. The fence was not a simple single-strand perimeter wire. It was a 7-strand construction, 4 barbed strands and 3 smooth, set at specific heights that Raymond had calculated based on the animals he ran, the slope of the land, and what he knew about wind behavior in open pasture. The wire tensions were not uniform. Raymond had tightened each section based on its exposure. The strands running across the open north face of the pasture, the face that caught prevailing weather, were pulled harder than the strands running east to west along the low ground. Every corner post had been set 3 feet deeper than standard, braced in an H pattern with a horizontal timber, and then tamped with a combination of packed clay and gravel that Raymond had learned from a post-setting manual his father had ordered from an agricultural college in 1948. He had read that manual so many times the spine was gone. The bracing system on the corner assemblies alone took Raymond an extra half-day per corner. There were 18 corners across the 200 acres. He built every one of them the same way, taking no shortcuts at the last 4, even though the light was fading and his hands ached. He never hurried a corner. To understand why Raymond Aldiss built fences the way he did, you need to understand who taught him. Raymond Earl Aldiss was 61 years old in September of 1987. He had been farming the same 340 acres in Calloway County, Missouri, since he turned 22, and his father, Herbert Aldiss, handed him the deed with one sentence: "Don't lose it." Herbert Aldiss had been a man of unusual precision. He had come back from the Second World War with both his hands intact and a particular dislike of waste, and he had spent the next 4 decades farming with a thoroughness that his neighbors sometimes found exhausting and occasionally found embarrassing when their own fields were compared to his. Herbert did not farm fast. He farmed right. He checked his equipment before he needed to. He fixed fence before it failed. He kept records of rainfall, yield, soil temperature, and equipment hours in a series of hard-bound ledgers that Raymond still kept in a fireproof box in his barn office. But the thing Herbert taught Raymond that no ledger could capture was this: a fence built right once does not need to be built again. A fence built fast needs to be built twice, and the second time you build it, you are already behind. Herbert had learned this at a cost. In the spring of 1953, a line of severe storms moved through Calloway County and dropped sustained winds of 60 miles per hour across the north pasture. Herbert had put up that fence quickly the year before because he needed to move cattle and had a short window between field work. The fence came down in sections across half a mile of open pasture. He lost 4 head of cattle that night, 3 to the highway, or 1 to a neighbor's pond. The financial loss was not the thing that marked him. What marked him was walking that fence line in the morning and seeing exactly where every shortcut had failed. The shallow corner posts, the uneven tensions, the bracing that had seemed good enough in October and was not good enough in March. Herbert restrung that fence the following summer. He never built another fence quickly, and every time he taught Raymond how to set a corner or tension a strand, he said the same thing: "You are not building for today's weather." Raymond had heard that sentence so many times he sometimes heard it in his father's voice, even when no one was speaking. Herbert passed in 1979. Raymond had been running the farm alone since then, with Edna's help and the occasional labor of his son Dale, who was 26 in 1987 and had his own small operation 12 miles east. Raymond maintained every fence line on the property according to the system Herbert had built. He walked them twice a year, once in April, once in October, and noted every loose wire, every leaning post, every staple beginning to work its way free. He fixed what he found the same week. His neighbors thought he was peculiar about it. Gerald Holt thought he was peculiar about all of it: the old wire, the old methods, the absence of any powered equipment in his fencing operation. Gerald had offered to sell Raymond a hydraulic post driver 3 separate times since 1982. Raymond had thanked him each time and declined. At the Calloway Feed and Supply, where farmers gathered most mornings around the coffee urn near the seed display, Raymond's fencing habits were a topic that came up with some regularity. It was generally agreed that Raymond Aldiss built good fence, but that he was stubborn about wire that should have been retired, and slow about a job that a man with modern equipment could finish in a fraction of the time. When someone mentioned the North Pasture job in October of 1987, the counterman, a fellow named Stout, said he'd seen the wire Raymond was using and wouldn't trust it to hold a house cat. The men around the coffee urn laughed. Raymond, who was standing at the far end of the counter buying staples, said nothing. He paid for his staples, thanked Stout by name, and walked out to his truck. Gerald Holt's high-tensile fencing operation was, by any fair measure, impressive. In the years between 1982 and 1989, Gerald had put up somewhere between 800 and 1,000 acres of new fence across Calloway County and the 2 counties bordering it. He ran a crew of 3, operated a hydraulic post driver mounted on a Case 1 845 skid steer, and could string high-tensile wire off a power reel faster than most farmers could hand-twist a single tie. His fence went up clean and fast and straight, and it looked exactly like what it was: modern, professional, and expensive. Gerald had been hired by 4 of Raymond's nearest neighbors in those years. The Pruitt farm on the north took 12.5-gauge high-tensile along its entire west and south perimeter, about 90 acres of new fence. The Deering operation to the east had Gerald refence their entire river bottom, 110 acres of heavy timber ground where the old posts had rotted. The Kessler brothers south of town hired Gerald for 60 acres of cross-fencing to divide their pasture rotation. Everyone was satisfied. Gerald's fence was tight and clean and went up without any of the slow handwork that Raymond insisted on. When people asked Gerald about fencing, which they often did because he was the man to ask, he explained that modern high-tensile wire held more tension, resisted corrosion better, and required less maintenance than any salvaged wire, regardless of how carefully it was set. He was not wrong about any of those things as general statements. He talked about his equipment the way some men talk about a good truck, with a specific pride that came from knowing it was the best thing available. What Gerald did not talk about, because it had not yet happened, was what his fence would do in a serious storm. In the late afternoon of August 19, 1989, a Category 3 hurricane remnant moved inland from the Gulf of Mexico and tracked northeast across the lower Midwest with a speed and fury that the National Weather Service in Springfield had been tracking for 2 days, but had not expected to retain so much of its intensity this far from the coast. By the time the system reached Calloway County, Missouri, it had weakened from its peak, but still carried sustained winds of 71 miles per hour, with gusts measured at the county airport at 86 miles per hour. It arrived at roughly 4 in the afternoon and stayed for 3 hours. Raymond Aldiss was in his barn when the wind hit. He had spent the morning watching the sky and the afternoon moving everything that could move into shelter: equipment, feed, a roll of baling wire he'd left on the fence line, 2 of Edna's flower pots from the porch. He had checked his fence line on the north pasture that morning, walking it in the early light, pressing each corner post with his shoulder, pulling each brace wire with his fingers. Everything was where he had put it 2 years before. He sat in the barn and listened to the storm. 3 miles north of Raymond's farm, the Pruitt operation was losing fence. Gerald Holt's high-tensile wire, which he had installed in the fall of 1985 along the Pruitt west and south perimeter, began to fail at the southwest corner approximately 40 minutes into the storm. The corner post, a steel T-post that Gerald had driven 4 feet into the ground with his hydraulic driver, pulled free of the softened clay in a single violent lurch as a gust hit the wire along a straight 800-foot run. When that corner went, the tension that had been distributed along the entire run released at once, and the wire snapped back through the line of posts with enough force to pull 3 of them free before the energy dissipated. 260 feet of fence came down in about 4 seconds. Roy Pruitt's herd, 63 head of Black Angus, found the opening within 20 minutes. By nightfall, Roy Pruitt had located 41 of his cattle. The other 22 had scattered north across his neighbor's winter wheat crop. It took 3 days and the help of 6 neighbors to recover all of them. 1 cow had been struck by a vehicle on the county road and had to be put down. The Deering River bottom fence failed along a low section where Gerald's crew had encountered standing water during installation and had compensated by reducing post depth. Those posts came out in a cluster near the bend in the creek, and about 80 feet of wire went with them into the water. The Kessler cross-fencing held, but one of Gerald's corner assemblies, a single-post braced corner that Gerald had used instead of the full H-brace because the ground was rocky, leaned significantly and was considered compromised. The Kesslers spent 2 weeks resetting it that fall. Raymond Aldiss walked his north pasture fence line on the morning of August 20th. He found 2 staples that had worked slightly loose on a post near the low corner at the northeast end. A post he made a note to check again in spring. He found no other damage across the full 200 acres. His corner assemblies had not moved. His bracing had not moved. His wire, old as it was, kinked as it was still at the tension he had set it to in November of 1987. He walked back to the barn, put his pliers on the nail where they always hung, and went to help Edna clear the branches from the yard. Gerald Holt drove past Raymond's north pasture on the afternoon of August 21st. He slowed his truck at the fence line along the county road and looked at the wire for a long time. He had spent the previous 2 days helping Roy Pruitt track cattle and had already been out to look at what remained of his fence on the Pruitt west perimeter. The corner post was still in the ground, tilted at about 30 degrees, a single strand of high-tensile wire hanging from it like a loose thread. He sat in his truck and looked at Raymond's fence. 7 strands of old wire, kinks and all, tight as the day it was set. The cedar posts were perfectly plumb. The corner assembly at the road end of the north pasture, visible from where he sat, had not shifted a fraction of an inch. Gerald was in the yard of the Calloway Feed and Supply the following Thursday morning. Raymond was there too, buying more staples. He always seemed to be buying staples, and the 2 men were the only ones there at that hour. Gerald was quiet for a moment. He took off his cap and looked at it the way men do when they are trying to decide how to start something difficult. "Your fence came through all right," he said. Raymond glanced at him. "It did." Another pause. Gerald put his cap back on. He looked at the ground, then back up. "Mine didn't." He said it flat, no excuse behind it. "The Pruitt southwest corner blew out, 80 feet on the Deerings. Kessler's northeast corner is going to need resetting." He let out a slow breath. "Roy Pruitt lost a cow to the road." Raymond nodded once. "I was watching you put that fence up," Gerald said. 2 years ago, I said—" He stopped. The words he'd used were still available to him, every one of them. He had said them loudly, with witnesses. "I said it was garbage wire and it wouldn't stand for 30 days. "I heard you," Raymond said. There was nothing mean in how he said it. He was simply confirming that the words had reached him, that Gerald need not wonder. Gerald looked at the fence line down the road, at least the section of it visible from the supply yard, wire still straight in the morning light. "How did it hold?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Raymond was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be deciding how much was worth saying. High-tensile wire under high tension fails from a single point, he said. One corner goes, the whole run releases. You can put it up in a day, but you're storing all that energy in the system, and if anything breaks the chain, the wire fights back. He paused. That wire I used is lower gauge, more flexible, set to an even tension all the way around. It doesn't store the same energy. When the wind pushed it, it moved a little, absorbed it, and came back. It didn't have a failure point because there was no single point holding everything. He picked up his bag of staples from the counter. And the corners, he added. You have to build the corners like they're going to hold the world. Everything else just follows from the corners. Gerald Holt stood in the parking lot of Calloway Feed and Supply and did not say anything for several seconds. He was a man who built fence for a living, and he had just been told something true that he had not known. "Your father teach you that?" he said. "He taught me the corners," Raymond said. "The rest I figured out over time." Gerald nodded slowly. He extended his hand. Raymond shook it, once, firm, and let go. Neither man said anything else. Raymond put his staples in the cab of his truck and drove south toward his farm. Gerald stood where he was for a moment longer, then got in his own truck and sat there with the engine off. By the first week of September 1989, the story of Raymond Aldiss's fence had moved through Calloway County the way all true stories move through small communities, without announcement, in pieces, spreading out from the people who had seen things directly to the people who had only heard about them, growing more specific rather than less as it traveled, because the specific details were the parts worth keeping. Roy Pruitt told it first, at the co-op in town on the Thursday following the storm. He told it the way a man tells a story when he is still processing what it means, carefully, with pauses, and checking the details against what he actually remembered. He had lost a cow. Gerald's fence had failed. Raymond's fence, 2 miles south, had not moved. Roy had driven past it himself because he needed to see it with his own eyes, and he said that standing there looking at that old wire in those old cedar posts, still tight, still plumb, he had felt something he could not quite name. Something between admiration and embarrassment, he said, because his own fence had been newer and more expensive, and it had come down in 4 seconds. The story reached the diner on the county road by the following Saturday. The counterman at Calloway Feed and Supply, the same stout who had said Raymond's wire wouldn't hold a house cat, told a version of it to every customer for about 2 weeks. Because he had been standing there when Gerald Holt shook Raymond's hand in the parking lot, and he understood that he had witnessed something that the county would be talking about for a long time. Gerald Holt did not avoid telling it. That surprised people who knew him, because Gerald was a proud man, and proud men usually find ways to let bad stories die quietly. Gerald did the opposite. He brought it up himself, to his crew, to his clients, to farmers who asked him about fencing after that fall. He told it straight, the same way Raymond had told him the lesson. No excuses, no qualifications. He said that he had laughed at an old man for using old wire, and that old wire had outlasted everything he put up himself in a serious storm. He changed how he built corners. The fall of 1989 and every season after that, Gerald Holt's crews built H-brace corner assemblies on every run, set 3 feet deeper than he had been driving them. He got the depth number from Raymond, who gave it to him without ceremony, standing in the supply yard in the same tone he might use to give someone the time of day. Gerald kept a photograph from that August, not of the storm damage, but of Raymond's north pasture fence line, taken on a calm morning the week after, wire still straight in the early light. He kept it tacked to the wall of his shop. When people asked him what it was, he told them. He told them all of it. Raymond Aldiss farmed his 340 acres for 11 more years after the storm. He walked his fence lines every April and every October. He replaced posts when they needed replacing and wire when it needed replacing. And he did both jobs the same way he had always done them. Slowly, completely, with attention given to the corners above everything else. He never mentioned the storm to anyone who didn't ask directly. He did not bring it up at the co-op or the feed store or at the church parking lot on Sunday mornings. He did not have any interest in the story of his fence becoming his identity. He already knew the fence would hold. He had known it in November of 1987 when he drove the last staple into the last post on the south end of the north pasture and walked the line one final time before the light failed. The storm had not told him anything new. In the spring of 1998, Raymond sat his son Dale down at the kitchen table and spent an afternoon going through Herbert's old ledgers, the ones kept in the fireproof box in the barn office. He explained the tension system, the corner depths, the specific reasoning behind the post spacing on exposed ground versus sheltered ground. Dale was 37 by then and had his own fencing habits, some of them correct and some of them shortcuts he hadn't yet been tested on. He listened carefully. He asked a few questions. Raymond answered them all. The following fall, Raymond drove Dale out to the north pasture and walked him through the full 200-acre perimeter. He showed him each corner assembly. He showed him the H-braces and explained why each horizontal timber was positioned where it was. He pressed his shoulder against each corner post and showed Dale that there was no movement, not after 11 years. He showed him the wire, still serviceable, still at tension, original installation points visible in the old cedar. He said one thing at the end of the walk, standing at the southwest corner as the light went flat and gray in the west. "When it finally needs rebuilding," he said, "build it the same way." Dale nodded. He understood that this was not just a sentence about fence. In the fall of 2003, a fast-moving severe thunderstorm with measured gusts of 73 miles per hour moved through Calloway County on a Tuesday evening in October. Dale Aldiss had been farming his father's original land for 2 years by then, Raymond having passed in the early spring of 2001 at 84, quietly, in the same house where he had been born. Dale walked the north pasture fence line the morning after the storm. He carried the same wire pliers that Raymond had always carried, kept on the same nail in the barn where Raymond had always hung them. He found 4 staples that had worked slightly loose near the low northeast corner. He also found, near the middle of the south run, a single strand of wire that had been struck by a falling tree branch and needed about 8 feet of replacement. He made a note of both in a ledger he kept in the barn office. The rest of the fence was exactly as it had been set. Raymond's corners had not moved. Dale did the repairs the following weekend by hand, the same way his father had taught him and his grandfather had taught his father. He took no shortcuts at the corners, even on the last 2 where the light was fading and his hands were cold. That November, when he drove out to the county fair where the Historical Society had its display every year, a collection of old equipment kept in running condition by a small group of retired farmers and their grown children. He had donated a piece of Raymond's equipment the year before, and he went by to check on it. The man running the display, an old farmer named Carver, who had known Raymond for 40 years, shook Dale's hand and asked about the north pasture fence. "Still holding?" Carver said. "Still holding," Dale said. Carver nodded as if this was the expected answer, which it was. There is a kind of knowledge that does not shout. It does not advertise itself. It does not come with a warranty or a horsepower rating or a per-acre cost that you can put on an invoice. It comes from a father's hands and a grandfather's ledger and a manual ordered from an agricultural college in 1948, and it lives in the patience of the person who received it, and it shows itself, finally and completely, only when the wind is high enough. The north pasture fence is still standing. Some problems don't need a better answer. They need the right one, built all the way to the corners,